Today, we reveal the story of a man who created Russia and whom history betrayed into oblivion. Ivan III, unifier of lands, liberator from the horde, builder of empire. A man whose name should stand alongside Peter I, but about whom textbooks remain silent, monuments remain silent, popular memory remains silent. Why? So, let's begin. The man who created Russia disappeared from history, completely. On the 10th of February 1446, in the Trinity Sergius Monastery, an event occurred that turned the fate of the Muscovite dynasty upside down. Vasily II, Grand Prince of Moscow, was praying when armed men burst into the church. Dmitry Shemyaka's soldiers, his cousin, his rival. They dragged Vasily out of the monastery, not to kill him. That would have been too simple, too clean. Shemyaka understood power differently. He understood symbols. They blinded him. Not in darkness, not in secret. They heated the irons. They brought the prince to the executioner. They held his head, and they burned out his eyes. Both of them, methodically, ritually. Why the eyes? Because a blind man cannot rule. In the political theology of medieval Rus, the prince must see his realm, must look into the eyes of boyars, must watch the enemy approach. A blind prince is not a prince. He is a living ghost, a warning, a lesson in flesh. Shemyaka wanted to eliminate Vasily without killing him. He wanted to create a living monument to his own power. He succeeded. For 3 weeks. Then Vasily returned to Moscow, blind, supported by monks from Kirilov Monastery, supported by boyars who feared Shemyaka's unpredictability more than they pitied Vasily's darkness. He reclaimed the throne. He ruled for 16 more years, without eyes. His son watched all of this. Ivan was 6 years old when they blinded his father. 6 years old when he learned that power is not about strength or courage or birthright. Power is about networks, about timing, about turning your enemy's cruelty into your own legitimacy. The child who witnessed his father's mutilation would grow into a man who never fought a battle he could avoid, who never took a risk he could calculate away, who built an empire not with a sword, but with patience. Friends, let's take a breath here. We're not claiming we know everything. Quite the opposite. We want to hear from you. Comments, what city you're from, your profession. All this brings us closer. If you find this interesting, hit like and subscribe. And now, let's continue. 1462, March. Vasily II died. Ivan inherited the throne. 22 years old. He had been co-ruler since age 12, his blind father's eyes, his father's hands in military campaigns. But now, the throne was his alone. What did he inherit? Not an empire, not even a strong principality. He inherited a fragile coalition of territories, formerly dependent on the Golden Horde, surrounded by enemies on all sides, and divided from within by his own brothers. The Muscovite Principality in 1462 covered approximately 430,000 square kilometers. Sounds impressive, until you look at the map. To the west, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, massive, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, controlling Smolensk, Bryansk, Chernigov, ancient Russian cities that should have been Moscow's. Lithuania was not just big. It was culturally sophisticated, militarily powerful, and expanding. Its Grand Duke, Casimir IV, ruled territories 3 times larger than Moscow's. To the east, the Kazan Khanate, a direct descendant of the Golden Horde, aggressive, wealthy from Volga trade, raiding Russian lands annually, taking slaves, burning villages. Moscow paid tribute. Not to the great horde far in the south, but to Kazan, close and dangerous. To the north, Novgorod the Great, Not an enemy, technically, but not an ally either. Novgorod was a republic, the only functioning democracy on Russian lands, a city-state with its own foreign policy, its own trade networks with the Hanseatic League, its own vision of what Rus should be, a vision that did not include submission to Moscow. And inside Moscow's own lands, Ivan's brothers. Yuri held Dmitrov, Boris controlled Voloklamsky, Andrei the Elder ruled Uglich, Andrei the Younger governed Vologda. Each brother had his own court, his own military druzhina, his own treasury. Their father's will specified they must obey the Grand Prince, but wills are paper, swords are steel. The testament of Vasily II still exists in the Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts, Fond 135, Opus 1, document number 23. The language is careful, diplomatic. The brothers must hold together and not seek their own. They must recognize Ivan as older brother and father. Beautiful words, meaningless words, because the appanage system, the Udel system, was not a hierarchy. It was a federation of princes who happened to share blood and a family name. Each brother could wage his own wars, make his own treaties, mint his own coins. The Grand Prince was first among equals, but equals do not obey. Moscow in 1462 was not the Third Rome. It was barely the third city in its own region. The principality's military force consisted of approximately 5,000 mounted warriors, professional soldiers, members of the Grand Prince's druzhina and service landholders. In a major campaign, Moscow could mobilize perhaps 15,000 men total, including militia and urban levies. Kazan could field similar numbers, Lithuania 10 times more. The Great Horde, in theory, could assemble 30,000 horsemen. Novgorod's army was smaller, but defended by swamps, forests, and the wealth to hire mercenaries. Ivan III inherited a state that existed by permission. Permission from the Horde, permission from Lithuania, permission from his brothers. One wrong move, and Moscow would dissolve like morning fog. But there was something else he inherited, something invisible, something his blind father taught him, the architecture of power. When you cannot see, you must build differently. You cannot rely on charisma, on presence, on the warrior's aura. You must create systems, structures, mechanisms that work whether you watch them or not. Vasily the Blind governed through clerks, through written orders, through a growing bureaucracy of dyaks, scribes who remembered what the prince could not see. Ivan learned this. He learned that power is not heroic, it is administrative. He learned something else too. He learned fear. Not the fear of cowards, the fear of architects, the fear that your structure will collapse because you missed a detail, forgot a connection, trusted the wrong beam. In 1462, Ivan was not a warrior prince. He had participated in campaigns as his father's co-ruler, the siege of Kazan in 1467, raids against the Tatars in 1469, but these were learning exercises, supervised violence. He had never commanded alone, never made the decision that kills thousands. He was something stranger, a bureaucrat with a crown, a calculator on a throne. The chronicles describe him as tall, thin, slightly hunched. He walked with his head down, as if reading documents on an invisible desk before him. He spoke little. When he did speak, his voice was quiet, and people had to lean in to hear. This was not shyness. This was technique. When people lean toward you to listen, they are already bending. His court was different from his father's. Vasily's court had been a warrior's hall, loud, drunken, full of boasting and challenges. Ivan's court was quiet, orders given in whispers, decisions recorded in duplicate, every boyar's oath written down and witnessed, every promise documented. This drove the old nobility insane. They were used to a world of oral agreements, of honour, of a man's word sealed with a drink. Ivan trusted nothing he could not read. In June of 1462, his brother Yuri sent a message, a friendly message. Yuri wanted to discuss their father's will, specifically the part about trade revenues from Dimitrov. Surely Ivan, as the elder brother, would be fair. Ivan invited Yuri to Moscow. They talked. Ivan agreed to review the revenues. He ordered his scribes to prepare documents. 3 months later, Yuri received a letter. Very detailed, very bureaucratic, explaining why, according to the testament's precise wording, Dimitrov's revenues belonged to the Grand Prince, with citations, with references, with copies of their father's signature. Yuri had no response. How do you argue with a document? How do you fight paper? This was Ivan's genius. He did not confront. He did not threaten. He documented you into submission. But documentation only works if you survive long enough to enforce it. And in 1462, survival was not guaranteed. The Great Horde still held the Yarlik, the patent of authority that made the Grand Prince of Moscow legitimate. Every year Moscow sent tribute: gold, furs, silver. The exact amounts are recorded in Horde correspondence preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives and in Russian chronicles. Approximately 1,000 rubles annually, a colossal sum, equivalent to the entire tax revenue of several provincial towns. The tribute was not just money, it was submission. It was theatre. Muscovite envoys travelled to Sarai, the Horde's capital on the lower Volga. They prostrated themselves before the Khan. They accepted the Yarlik on their knees. They rode back to Moscow with a document that said, in beautiful Turkic script, "Moscow rules because we allow it." Ivan sent the tribute in 1462, and in 1463, and in 1464. He was waiting. Waiting for what? The chronicles do not say, but Ivan had learned from his father's mistake. Vasily had fought Shemyaka directly and lost his eyes. Ivan would not fight directly. He would wait until the structure itself shifted, until the moment when not paying tribute became possible. That moment was coming, but it would take 18 years. Meanwhile, there was Novgorod. Novgorod the Great. Gospodin Veliki Novgorod. Lord Great Novgorod, as they called themselves. A city of 40,000 people, wealthy beyond Moscow's dreams. Their merchant quarter had stone houses, not wooden, stone. Their churches were covered in frescoes by Byzantine masters. Their vecha, popular assembly, elected their posadnik, their mayor, and dismissed him when he failed. Novgorod traded directly with Lubeck, with Hamburg, with Riga. German merchants lived in Novgorod's foreign quarter year-round. Novgorodian merchants lived in Visby and Tallinn. The city's wealth came not from land or tribute, but from trade. Furs from the northern forests, wax, honey, timber. In exchange, Flemish cloth, German metalwork, Spanish wine. This was not how power worked in Moscow. Moscow's power was agricultural, land, peasants, grain, control of territory. Novgorod's power was commercial, networks, information, credit. The two systems could not coexist, but in 1462, Ivan could not challenge Novgorod. Not yet. Novgorod was too rich, too connected, too confident. Their militia was small, but their walls were strong, and behind them stood the possibility of Lithuanian intervention. So Ivan did nothing. He sent diplomatic letters, polite letters, letters addressing the Novgorodian Vecher as brothers, letters proposing trade agreements, letters that documented carefully every time Novgorod's posadnik failed to consult Moscow about foreign policy. He was building a case, in paper, for a trial that would be held in steel. The first decade of Ivan's reign is strange to read in the chronicles. Almost nothing happens. A few border raids, a minor conflict with Kazan, resolved through negotiation, a treaty with the Crimean Khanate, minor khans in the south barely noticed. Ivan married Marfa Boretskaya. No, that was later. He married Maria of Tver, a political marriage. She gave him a son, Ivan the Young, in 1468. 10 years of apparent inaction, 10 years when other princes would have been desperate to prove themselves, to win glory, to earn their boyars' respect through conquest. Ivan did none of this. He reorganized the tax collection system. He expanded the Dyak bureaucracy. He began requiring written inventories of all boyar estates. He commissioned new copies of old treaties, stored in duplicate in fireproof chambers. Boring, tedious, unworthy of chronicles, and absolutely essential. Because Ivan understood what his contemporaries did not. In the 15th century, states did not collapse from military defeat. They collapsed from administrative chaos. They collapsed when nobody knew who owed what to whom, when boyars could claim lands without documentation, when tribute disappeared into pockets, when the prince's orders vanished between Moscow and the provinces. Ivan was building a machine, a state machine, piece by piece, clerk by clerk, document by document. In 1467, Kazan attacked, again. Raids along the Oka River, villages burned, slaves taken. The boyars demanded response, military glory, a punitive expedition. Ivan agreed. He assembled an army, 15,000 men. He appointed commanders, experienced warriors, veterans of his father's campaigns. He gave speeches about Muscovite honor. Then he sent a separate secret embassy to Kazan. The embassy carried a letter. The letter proposed a treaty. Kazan would stop raiding. Moscow would pay a modest annual gift, not tribute, a gift. In exchange, Kazan would recognize Moscow's right to the Upper Oka territories, and Kazan's Khan, Ibrahim, would receive Moscow's support against his own rivals within the Khanate. Ibrahim agreed. The Muscovite army marched to the border, set up camp, waited. After 2 weeks, news arrived. Kazan had accepted terms. The campaign was over. The army returned home. The boyars were furious. Where was the battle? Where was the glory? Where were the slaves and plunder? Ivan's response, recorded in the Nikon Chronicle, "We achieved our goal. The raids have stopped. Why spend blood when words suffice?" This became his method. Threaten war, negotiate peace, document everything. But this method only works if your threats are credible, and in 1467 they were not. Moscow's army was adequate for defense, weak for offense. Everyone knew this. So Ivan began rebuilding the military, not dramatically, not with grand proclamations, quietly. He expanded the pomestye system, granting land to warriors not as hereditary property, but as conditional tenure. Serve, and you keep the land. Fail to serve, and it reverts to the prince. This created a class of military servicemen personally dependent on the Grand Prince, not on their father's traditions, not on boyar networks, on Ivan. He imported military technology, crossbows from Italy, cannon from Germany. He established the first permanent artillery corps in Moscow, small, just 20 guns, but permanent, with trained crews, with documented supply chains. He studied siegecraft, not personally, he never led a siege himself, but he read reports, Italian reports, German reports, Byzantine reports translated from Greek. He learned that medieval warfare was 90% logistics and 10% violence. And he waited. 1471. A crisis. The great horde's Khan, Ahmed, sent a message to Moscow. Not a request, a demand. The tribute had been insufficient. Moscow must send additional payments. Immediately. The boyars panicked. Ahmed was strong. He had just defeated rivals within the horde. He had 30,000 horsemen. If he attacked, Moscow could not win. Ivan called a council. The boyars expected submission, expected Ivan to send gold, to apologize, to prostrate Moscow once again. Instead, Ivan asked a question. How much gold do we have in the treasury? The treasurer reported, approximately 3,000 rubles in coin, plus considerable valuables. Ivan's next question. How much does it cost to bribe the Crimean Khan? Silence. Then understanding. Ivan was proposing to pay one enemy to fight another, to turn the horde's internal politics into Moscow's weapon. The treasurer hesitated. The Crimean Khan, Mengli-Giray, might accept 1,000 rubles, perhaps less if we offer ongoing support. Ivan nodded. Send the embassy, secretly. Tell Ahmed we are preparing the tribute. Tell him it will arrive in spring. The embassy to Crimea carried gold. It also carried a proposal. Moscow would support Mengli-Giray's claim to supremacy among the Tatar Khanates. In exchange, Crimea would raid the Great Horde's territories. Not a war, just pressure, distraction. Mengli agreed. In spring of 1472, the Great Horde prepared to march north to collect Moscow's tribute. Then, Crimean raiders hit their supply camps. Small raids. Annoying. Not enough to force battle, but enough to delay the campaign. Ahmed turned south to deal with Crimea. Moscow's tribute could wait. Ivan had bought time. With gold. With diplomacy. With an understanding that power is not about dominance, but about manipulating systems. This was the man who inherited a broken principality in 1462. This was the method he developed over 10 years of apparent inaction. He was not a hero. He was something more dangerous. He was an architect who understood that empires are not conquered, they are constructed, brick by brick, treaty by treaty, document by document. And he was about to build something that would last 5 centuries. But first, he had to destroy something 400 years old, something that represented everything he was not: direct, democratic, chaotic, alive. Novgorod. The mechanism Ivan constructed in his first decade would face its ultimate test not on a battlefield, but on a frozen river where 2 armies stared at each other for weeks and nobody died. But before the Ugra, there was Novgorod, 1471, spring. A message arrived in Moscow from the Novgorodian Veche, not to Ivan personally, to the Grand Prince of Moscow, the title, not the man. The message proposed a defensive alliance against Lithuania, standard diplomacy, expected protocol, except for one detail. The message was also sent to Casimir IV, Grand Duke of Lithuania and King of Poland. The same message, the same proposal. Novgorod was offering to ally with Lithuania if Moscow declined. This was Novgorod's traditional game: play Moscow against Lithuania, keep both at arm's length, maintain independence through balance. For 2 centuries, this strategy had worked. Ivan read the message. He called no council. He issued no public response. Instead, He ordered his scribes to search the archives. Every treaty between Moscow and Novgorod since the 13th century, every agreement, every dispute, every case where Novgorod had consulted a foreign power without Moscow's permission. The scribes worked for months. They produced a document, 70 pages, handwritten, cataloging 240 years of Novgorodian violations of Moscow's overlordship. Most of these violations were technical, interpretations of ancient treaties, arguments about whether Novgorod belonged to the Grand Prince or was merely allied with him. Legal minutiae. But minutiae become weapons when documented. In November 1471, Ivan sent a response to Novgorod. Not angry, not threatening, simply factual. The message listed 37 cases where Novgorod had violated treaty obligations. It requested clarification. It proposed negotiations. The Novgorodian Vetch ignored it. 1472. The year everything accelerated. In May, a fire destroyed half of Moscow's Kremlin, the wooden walls, the Grand Prince's palace, the Treasury building. Chronicles describe the flames as divine punishment, though more likely it was carelessness, a candle, a spark, spring wind. Ivan used the fire as opportunity. He announced plans to rebuild in stone, not wood, stone. He sent envoys to Italy, to the Pope's territories, searching for architects. He needed engineers who understood fortification, who could design walls that cannon could not breach. This was unusual. Moscow had master builders. Why import foreigners? Because Ivan was thinking beyond Moscow. He was thinking about Novgorod's walls, about Kazan's walls, about the fortifications he would need to take, not just defend. In August 1472, another message from Novgorod, this one different. A faction within the Vetch, led by Marfa Boretskaya, widow of the former Posadnik, proposed a formal alliance with Lithuania. Not just negotiation, actual submission. Novgorod would recognize Casimir as protector. In exchange, Lithuania would guarantee Novgorodian independence from Moscow. The Vetch debated for 3 days. The chronicles, both Novgorodian and Muscovite sources, describe violent arguments. Merchants opposed the Lithuanian alliance. They feared losing trade access to Muscovite territories. The Boyar faction, led by Marfa, argued that Lithuanian protection was preferable to Muscovite absorption. The Vetch voted. The Lithuanian alliance passed. Barely. This was the trigger Ivan had been waiting for. Not because the alliance was dangerous. Casimir was weak, distracted by conflicts in Poland, but because it gave Ivan legal justification. Novgorod had committed treason against Moscow's overlordship, against Orthodox unity, against Rus itself. Ivan did not immediately declare war. Instead, he sent another letter, this one addressed to Metropolitan Philip, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The letter detailed Novgorod's negotiations with Catholic Lithuania. It framed the issue not as politics, but as faith. Novgorod was betraying orthodoxy, allying with Rome's servants, risking the spiritual unity of Rus. Metropolitan Philip responded with a pastoral letter to Novgorod, gentle, concerned, warning that alliance with Catholic powers endangered souls. Novgorod's Archbishop Jonah replied that Novgorod's Orthodox faith was pure. The Lithuanian alliance was political, not religious. The exchange continued for months, letters, theological arguments, biblical citations. While the churchmen argued, Ivan assembled an army. Not secretly, he announced it. A defensive measure, he claimed, to protect Muscovite territories from potential Lithuanian aggression through Novgorodian lands. By June 1473, 20,000 men were camped near the Novgorod border. Novgorod panicked. The Veche sent urgent messages to Casimir. Where was Lithuanian support? Where were the troops? Casimir sent letters, diplomatic letters, promising support. Soon, very soon. No troops came. Ivan waited. His army sat at the border, eating Novgorodian food, which they purchased legally from Novgorodian merchants. Training, building field fortifications. The Novgorodian treasury was hemorrhaging money, maintaining militia, stockpiling supplies, bribing potential allies. In September, Ivan offered terms. Novgorod would renounce the Lithuanian alliance, would recognize Moscow's overlordship explicitly, would pay compensation for treaty violations, 15,000 rubles. 15,000 rubles, an astronomical sum, more than Novgorod's annual trade revenue. The Vetch refused. On July 14th, 1471, Ivan's army crossed the border. Not the full army, 5,000 men, a vanguard, commanded by Prince Daniil Komsky, one of Ivan's most experienced generals. The rest of the army remained in reserve. Novgorod mobilized its militia. Chronicles report 20,000 men, an impressive number, except most were merchants, craftsmen, peasant levies, men who had never fought a battle, led by boyars who had never commanded more than ceremonial guard units. The armies met on the Shelon River, July 27th. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre. Komsky deployed his cavalry in standard formation, 3 lines, center and 2 wings. He waited for the Novgorodian militia to advance. They advanced, disorganized, units mixing together. No clear command structure, because Vetch democracy extended to military command and nobody could agree who should lead. When the militia reached the Muscovite center, Komsky's wings enveloped them, the classic pincer. The Novgorodian line collapsed in minutes. The chronicles report 12,000 Novgorodian dead, an exaggeration certainly, but even half that number, 6,000, represents catastrophe. The flower of Novgorod's militia, the city's fighting men, gone. Muscovite casualties, fewer than 100. Komsky did not pursue to Novgorod. He stopped at the battlefield, sent messengers to Ivan, waited for orders. Ivan's orders arrived within days. Do not advance, hold position, wait. Why? Because Ivan understood that taking Novgorod by storm would be expensive. The city's walls were strong, supplies were adequate. A siege could last months. And a prolonged siege might actually bring Lithuanian intervention. Casimir could not ignore a city under assault without losing all credibility. Better to let Novgorod negotiate from weakness. In August, Novgorodian envoys arrived at Komsky's camp. They came to discuss terms. The terms were brutal. 15,000 rubles, immediate payment, recognition of Moscow's complete authority over Novgorodian foreign policy, dismissal of Archbishop Jonah, who had supported the Lithuanian alliance. The envoys returned to Novgorod. The Vecha met. They had no choice. The army was destroyed. Lithuanian help had not materialized. The treasury could barely cover the payment, but bankruptcy was preferable to siege. On November 5th, 1471, Novgorod accepted Moscow's terms. Ivan had won, without fighting personally, without even approaching Novgorod's walls. He had used military threat to create economic crisis, then offered peace as extortion. The 15,000 rubles arrived in Moscow in January 1472, in silver, transported in 40 wagons, guarded by Muscovite soldiers, who were paid from Novgorodian funds. Ivan used the money to finance his Kremlin reconstruction, stone walls, Italian engineers, the foundation of Moscow's transformation into an imperial capital, built with Novgorodian silver. But this was not the end. It was a rehearsal. For 6 years, Novgorod paid tribute, obeyed Moscow's foreign policy dictates, suffered. The city's trade declined. German merchants began bypassing Novgorod, dealing directly with Moscow through intermediaries. The Vecha's authority eroded as Moscow's governors, technically advisors, began supervising major decisions. By 1477, Novgorod was a republic in name only. Then, in September 1477, something changed. A faction within the Vech attempted to send an embassy to Lithuania. Again, not an alliance, just communication. Exploring options. Ivan's spies reported this immediately. On October 3rd, 1477, Ivan left Moscow with an army, 15,000 men. He did not send warnings, did not negotiate, simply marched. By November, he arrived at Novgorod's gates. This time, he did not stop outside. He entered the city with his army. The Vecha bell, the symbol of Novgorodian independence, the instrument that called citizens to assembly for 4 centuries, hung in the bell tower of St. Sophia Cathedral. Bronze, ancient, sacred. Ivan ordered it removed. On November 15, 1477, Muscovite soldiers climbed the bell tower. They detached the bell from its frame, used pulleys to lower it. Chronicles describe the scene, the bell swinging as it descended, ringing once, twice, then silent. They loaded it onto a wagon, transported it to Moscow. There is a legend, recorded in the Novgorodian 4th Chronicle, that the bell fell from the wagon during transport and shattered, that Novgorod's voice broke on the road to Moscow. The legend is probably false. The bell likely arrived intact, but the metaphor was perfect. Novgorod's voice, broken. On January 13th, 1478, Ivan summoned the Vech for the last time. He addressed them personally, standing in the central square, surrounded by his soldiers. The chronicles record his words. There will be no Vech in Novgorod. There will be no posadnik. There will be no bell. The state will be ours, all of it. Silence. Then he announced the second phase. 7,000 families, boyars, wealthy merchants, anyone with significant property or political influence. They would be resettled to Moscow, to Vladimir, to provincial towns throughout Muscovite territories. Their lands confiscated, redistributed to Muscovite service gentry, men loyal to Ivan, men who owed everything to Moscow. This was new. This was unprecedented. Medieval rulers conquered cities, they demanded tribute, they installed governors, but they left the local elite in place, because local elites knew how to govern locally. Ivan did not want Novgorod governed, he wanted it erased. The resettlement began immediately. Lists were prepared, families identified. Muscovite clerks, the dyaks Ivan had been training for 15 years, arrived with documentation. Property inventories, transfer orders, guards. Families had 1 week to prepare. Then they were escorted out, not arrested, not imprisoned, simply relocated, given housing in their new cities, allowed to keep personal possessions, but their lands, their power base, their identity, confiscated. Marfa Boretskaya, the boyar woman who had led the Lithuanian faction, was not executed. She was tonsured, forced to become a nun, sent to a remote monastery in Nizhny Novgorod. She died there in 1487. Anonymous, forgotten. By March 1478, Novgorod was unrecognizable. The Vecha square stood empty, the bell tower silent. The boyar palaces occupied by Muscovite families who spoke with Moscow accents and swore loyalty to the Grand Prince. The city continued to exist. Merchants still traded, Craftsmen still worked. But the Novgorodian Republic, the 400-year experiment in Russian democracy, was finished. Ivan had not destroyed a city. He had destroyed a political model. And he had done it without mass executions, without burning, without theatrical cruelty. He had done it with deportation lists, with property transfers, with bureaucratic efficiency. This terrified other Russian princes more than any battle could, because it showed them the future. A future where power was not negotiated between equals, a future where the state was not a federation, but a hierarchy, a future where resistance meant not death, but erasure. But Novgorod was an internal matter, a problem within Rus. The external problem remained, the problem that had defined Russian politics for 250 years, the horde. 1479, Khan Ahmed of the Great Horde sent another demand. Moscow had not paid full tribute for 7 years. Make-up payments were required, plus penalties. Total, 20,000 rubles. The Boyar Council expected Ivan to pay. Moscow had just absorbed Novgorod's wealth. The treasury was full. The horde was still dangerous. Why risk war? Ivan called a council. Then he did something shocking. He tore up Ahmed's letter. Literally, physically, in front of his assembled boyars, ripped the Khan's ultimatum to pieces, threw them on the floor. Then he said, "Tell Ahmed this is his answer." The chronicles disagree about whether this actually happened, or whether it is legendary embellishment added later, but the action matches Ivan's documented behavior. He was done pretending. In June 1480, Ahmed assembled the Great Horde's army, 30,000 cavalry. He marched north, toward Moscow. This should have been Moscow's end. The horde had crushed Russian armies for centuries. Batu Khan's invasion in 1237, Mamai's campaigns, even defeats like Kulikovo in 1380 had not broken horde power. The Tatars had returned stronger. But Ahmed faced problems Batu never had. First, internal division. The Great Horde was not the unified Mongol Empire. It was one fragment among many. The Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, the Nogai Horde, all rivals, all waiting to exploit Ahmed's weakness. Second, Ivan's diplomacy. That treaty with Crimea from 1472, the modest annual gift, those carefully maintained relations, they were about to pay dividends. As Ahmed marched north, Ivan sent urgent messages to Mengli-Giray in Crimea. Ahmed is vulnerable. His supply lines are extended. His western flank is exposed. Attack now. He sweetened the offer. 5,000 rubles, immediate payment. Mengli agreed. In July 1480, Crimean raiders struck the Great Horde's rear territories. Not a full invasion, raids. Hit supply depots, burned camps, took captives. Ahmed could not ignore this. But he could not turn back either. That would look like retreat. So he continued north, faster, trying to force a quick decision before Crimea became a serious threat. Ivan assembled the Muscovite army, 25,000 men. He positioned them along the Oka River, the traditional defensive line. Ahmed arrived in September. He did not attack immediately. The Oka was fordable only at specific points, all defended. A direct assault would be costly. So Ahmed moved west, toward the Ugra River, a tributary of the Oka. The Ugra was smaller, more crossing points, less defensible. Ivan shadowed him, keeping the army between Ahmed and Moscow. They arrived at the Ugra in early October. Ahmed's army on the south bank, the Muscovite army on the north. And then, nothing happened. Ahmed did not attack. Ivan did not attack. The armies stared at each other across the river. Days passed. Weeks. The chronicles call this the standing on the Ugra, stojanje na Ugre. Not the battle of the Ugra, the standing, because nobody fought. Why? Ahmed was waiting for Lithuanian support. Casimir had promised troops, an alliance against Moscow. But Casimir was dealing with internal rebellions. The Lithuanians never came. Ivan was waiting for winter, for Ahmed's supplies to run low, for the Crimean raids to force Ahmed's hand. In late October, something strange happened. Ivan left the army. He did not announce a strategic withdrawal. He simply departed, rode back to Moscow, left his generals in command. The army was shocked. The boyars were furious. Moscow's citizens panicked. On November 1st, 1480, Metropolitan Vasyan Rilo, the head of the Russian Church, sent a letter to Ivan. The letter still exists, preserved in the Voskresenskaya Chronicle. The language is extraordinary. Vasyan did not suggest, did not advise, he condemned. He called Ivan a coward, a deserter, a runner. You flee from the godless, and who will defend the flock? You abandon the army, and who will stand against the wolf? This was unprecedented. The church criticizing the Grand Prince publicly, accusing him of cowardice. Ivan ignored the letter. He stayed in Moscow for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, he conducted meetings with merchants, with foreign ambassadors, with his treasury officials. What was he doing? The answer became clear in November. Ahmed's army was starving. The Ugra region could not support 30,000 men indefinitely. Supply wagons from the south were being raided by Crimean cavalry. The river was starting to freeze. Soon Ahmed would have no defensive barrier. On November 11th, 1480, Ahmed retreated. Not in panic, in order. But he retreated, south, back toward Horde territories. Ivan's army did not pursue. They watched Ahmed leave. Then they returned to Moscow. The chronicles treat this as a miracle, God's intervention. The enemy fled without battle. But it was not a miracle. It was calculation. Ivan had understood something Ahmed did not. The Ugra was not the critical front. Crimea was, and Ivan had bought Crimea months earlier. Ahmed Khan died in January 1481, murdered by Nogai raiders in his own camp. Was Ivan involved? There is no direct evidence, but the timing is convenient, and the Nogai horde had received Muscovite gifts throughout 1480. With Ahmed dead, the great horde fragmented. Civil war, rival Khans. By 1482, it effectively ceased to exist as a unified power. The Mongol-Tatar yoke, 250 years of tribute, submission, humiliation, ended not with a battle, but with a standing, a waiting game, a diplomatic assassination. Moscow stopped paying tribute. Nobody demanded it. Nobody could. Ivan had freed Russia, and nobody could call him a hero, because he had won by leaving the battlefield, by refusing to fight, by turning war into economics and economics into assassination. Vasyan's accusation, coward, runner, deserter, stuck. Later chronicles tried to soften it, but the core remained. Ivan was not brave. He was something more dangerous than brave. He was effective. The horde was broken, but breaking an external enemy is simpler than erasing an internal alternative. Ahmed's death solved Moscow's Tatar problem. Novgorod's Vecher bell, silent in its Moscow warehouse, represented something more dangerous. Proof that Russians could govern themselves differently. Ivan understood this. which is why the Novgorod campaign of 1478 was merely preparation, a test, a rehearsal for something more systematic. Between 1478 and 1485, Ivan returned to Novgorod 4 more times, not with armies, with administrators. Each visit brought new deportations, new lists, new Muscovite families replacing Novgorodian ones. By 1485, the city's entire social structure had been replaced. The old boyar families, gone. The merchant dynasties, scattered. The craftsmen's guilds, dissolved and reformed under Muscovite supervision. The records are meticulous. Ivan's diaks kept careful lists. We know names, we know numbers. Approximately 12,000 families relocated between 1478 and 1490. 12,000 families from a city of 40,000 people, 1/3 of the population, replaced. This was not conquest. This was replacement. Surgical, bureaucratic, thorough. But why? Novgorod had surrendered, had paid tribute, had accepted Moscow's authority. Why not simply govern it the way medieval rulers governed conquered cities? Because Novgorod was not just a city, it was a model. The Novgorodian vecha system had worked for 400 years, longer than Moscow had existed, longer than the Mongol occupation. Through plague, through invasion, through economic crisis, the system had survived because it worked. The vech was not mob rule, it was structured democracy. The posadnik, mayor, was elected annually, from a pool of qualified candidates, men who had served as district administrators, who had proven administrative competence, who had support from multiple factions within the city. Elections were not simple votes. They involved complex procedures, nominations by district assemblies, approval by the sitting council, final ratification by the full vech. The process took weeks. It was designed to produce consensus, not victory. The posadnik governed with a council, the Council of Lords, Sovet Gospod, approximately 50 members, representing different social groups, boyars, merchants, craftsmen, even representatives from the urban districts. Major decisions required vech approval, but the vech did not micromanage. It set policy. The posadnik and council executed. This system had produced Novgorod's wealth because it aligned incentives. Merchants wanted trade protection. The posadnik depended on merchant support, so he protected trade. Craftsmen wanted fair taxation. The council included craftsmen's representatives, so taxation was negotiated, not imposed. Compare this to Moscow. In Moscow, the Grand Prince appointed all officials. Boyars held positions based on ancestry and service to the prince. There was no election, no accountability to citizens. Officials answered to the prince or to God. Citizens answered to officials. The Muscovite system produced loyalty, hierarchy, military efficiency. The Novgorodian system produced wealth, innovation, trade networks. Both systems worked, for different purposes. And that was the problem. Because if both systems worked, then Ivan's model was not inevitable. It was a choice, and choices can be questioned. Alternatives can be imagined. Ivan could not permit alternatives. The vech bell was not just a signal device, it was a symbol. When it rang, it meant, we govern ourselves, we assemble, we debate, we decide. The prince serves us, we do not serve the prince. That bell rang for 4 centuries. Every citizen of Novgorod grew up hearing it, knowing that sound meant, you have a voice. Ivan took the bell in 1478. He did not destroy it immediately. He kept it, in storage, in Moscow. Why? Because destroying it would make it a martyr, an absent bell people could remember, mourn, rally around. But a bell in storage, in Moscow, in the Grand Prince's possession, That bell was not absent, it was captured, defeated, a trophy proving that democracy's voice could be silenced and carried away. The last Vetch meeting in Novgorod occurred on January 13th, 1478. We know the date from multiple chronicles. Both Muscovite and Novgorodian sources agree. Ivan addressed them, standing in the square where the Vetch had met for 400 years, surrounded by his soldiers. The speech was short. The chronicles preserve fragments. Different chronicles give different wordings, but the core is consistent. There will be no Vetch bell in Novgorod. There will be no posadnik. There will be no independence. The state will be mine. All of it. Then he left. The Vetch bell was already gone. The assembly square remained. But without the bell, how would citizens know to gather? Without the bell, how would they coordinate? They could not. Some historians argue the Vetch continued informally for years, secret meetings, resistance, underground democracy. The evidence for this is thin, a few mentions in later chronicles, rumors of assemblies in private houses, but nothing systematic, nothing documented. Why? Because the Vetch was not just an idea, it was infrastructure. The bell, the square, the procedural rules everyone understood, the social recognition that when the bell rang, you stopped work and participated. Remove the infrastructure and the idea collapses, not immediately, but gradually, within a generation. By 1490, children born in Novgorod had never heard the Vetch bell. They grew up in a city that looked like Novgorod, but functioned like Moscow, with appointed governors, with taxes set by Moscow, with no assembly, no debate, no choice. This was Ivan's genius. He did not need to convince Novgorodians that autocracy was better than democracy. He just needed to make democracy impossible to practice. The deportations served the same purpose. Novgorodian boyar families had institutional memory. They remembered how the Vetch worked, how elections proceeded, how consensus was built. They could teach their children, could preserve the knowledge. But scattered across Muscovite territories, isolated in provincial towns, surrounded by Muscovite neighbors who had never known democracy, what could they teach? Their children would grow up Muscovite, would serve the Grand Prince, would forget Novgorod except as ancestral nostalgia, a story grandparents told about a city that once existed. By 1500, Novgorod was Moscow. Administratively, economically, culturally, the city still existed, still traded, but the republic was extinct, and no one rebelled. This is the strange part, the part that makes historians uncomfortable. Novgorod did not fight. Oh, there was the Battle of Shelon in 1471, but that was the boyar faction, desperate, poorly organized. The general population? They accepted Muscovite rule, relatively quickly, relatively peacefully. Why? Some historians argue it was terror. Fear of deportation kept people compliant. But the deportations were selective, targeted at elites. Most Novgorodians were not deported. Most kept their property, their trades, their lives. They just lost their vote. Other historians argue it was economics. Moscow's trade networks were growing. Integration with Muscovite markets brought opportunities. Democracy was a luxury. Prosperity was necessity. Maybe. Or maybe democracy is fragile. Maybe it requires constant practice, constant infrastructure, constant social agreement that participation matters. Remove the infrastructure, make participation impossible, and within a generation, people forget they ever had power. The Vetch bell remained in Moscow for decades. No one knows exactly what happened to it. Some chronicles say it was melted down for canon. Others say it was recast into a church bell. One late legend claims it was buried, that it still exists somewhere beneath Moscow. The truth is probably mundane. It was probably melted down, recycled, turned into something useful for the state. But the legend matters more than the truth. Because the legend says, the voice of democracy is buried, hidden, waiting. While Ivan was erasing Novgorod, he was building something else. 1472, April. An Italian arrived in Moscow. His name was Ivan Fryazin, not his real name. Fryazin was Russian for Italian. His actual name was Gianbattista della Volpe. A merchant, a diplomat, a go-between. He carried a letter from Cardinal Bessarion. Bessarion was Greek, born in Trebizond, trained in Constantinople before its fall in 1453. He had fled to Italy, converted to Catholicism, become a cardinal in Rome. He was obsessed with one goal: reuniting the Orthodox and Catholic churches, healing the Great Schism of 1054. He believed this could be accomplished through marriage, specifically the marriage of Ivan III to Sophia Paleologina. Sophia was Byzantine royalty. Her uncle, Constantine XI, had been the last Byzantine emperor. He died defending Constantinople's walls in 1453 when the Ottomans took the city. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Rome, the guardian of Orthodox Christianity for 1,000 years, ended that day. Sophia escaped. She was 12. She fled to Italy with her family, ended up under Bessarion's protection. He raised her Catholic, educated her in Latin, Greek, theology, diplomacy. By 1469, she was 19, unmarried. Bessarion saw an opportunity. Moscow was the largest Orthodox state still independent. Ivan was young, recently widowed. Maria of Tver had died in 1467. If Bessarion could marry Sophia to Ivan, perhaps Moscow could be brought into church union. Perhaps the schism could heal. Perhaps Rome and Moscow could unite against the Ottomans. It was a beautiful plan. It failed completely. But the failure produced something neither Bessarion nor Ivan anticipated. It produced the Third Rome. Ivan Fryazin's letter proposed the marriage. It came with gifts, jewels, books, relics from Rome. It came with promises, papal support, recognition of Moscow's importance, access to Italian trade networks. What it did not mention was the price. Church union, accepting papal supremacy, acknowledging Rome as the head of Christianity. Ivan read the letter, consulted with Metropolitan Philip, with his boyars, with his mother, who was still alive and influential. The boyars were skeptical. A Catholic bride, raised in Rome? This was dangerous, heretical. But Ivan saw opportunity. Not theological opportunity, political opportunity. Sophia was Constantine XI's niece. Marrying her would connect Moscow to Byzantium, to the imperial tradition, to the idea that Moscow could be Constantinople's heir. In June 1469, Ivan sent a return embassy to Rome. The message was carefully worded. Moscow was interested in the marriage. Discussions could proceed. Details would need negotiation. The message did not mention church union. Bessarion interpreted this as tacit agreement. Of course Ivan would accept union. Why else marry a Catholic bride raised in Rome? He was wrong. Negotiations took 3 years. Letters, embassies, discussions about dowry, about ceremony, about Sophia's status in Moscow. In 1472, Sophia departed Rome. She travelled with a papal legate, Antonio Bonumbre. He carried instructions from Pope Sixtus IV. At the wedding, Bonumbre would celebrate Catholic Mass. Sophia would remain Catholic. The marriage would symbolize church unity. The journey took months, across the Alps, through German territories, through Poland, into Lithuania, finally into Muscovite lands. The entourage reached Pskov in October 1472. Pskov was the first major Russian city on their route. The city's archbishop, along with Muscovite officials, came to greet them. Bonumbre entered Pskov carrying a large Latin cross. the symbol of papal authority. The Pskov crowd rioted, not violently, Russian riots rarely were, but they blocked the streets, refused to let the procession pass, shouted that the Latin cross was heresy, that it would pollute the city. The Muscovite officials intervened, quietly. They suggested Bonumbra put the cross away, for safety, temporarily. Bonumbra refused. He was the Pope's legate. He would not hide the cross. The standoff lasted 3 hours. Finally, a compromise. Bonumbra could keep the cross, but it would be wrapped in cloth, not displayed publicly. This was the beginning. The entourage reached Moscow in November. Ivan welcomed Sofia formally, state ceremony, gifts exchanged, polite speeches. Then came the wedding preparations. Bonumbra expected to officiate, Catholic ceremony, performed by a papal legate in Moscow. The symbolism would be enormous. Ivan's officials informed Bonumbra that the wedding would be Orthodox, performed by Metropolitan Philip, in the Assumption Cathedral, according to Russian rites. Bonumbra protested. This violated the agreement. Rome had sent Sofia on the understanding that church unity would be acknowledged. What agreement? Ivan's officials asked. Show us the document. There was no document. The agreement had been implicit, assumed, understood between diplomats. But Ivan did not operate on assumptions. He operated on documents, and no document specified a Catholic ceremony. On November 12, 1472, Ivan married Sofia. Orthodox ceremony, no papal involvement. Bonumbra attended as a guest, stood in the back, watched Moscow appropriate Byzantine legitimacy without giving Rome anything in return. Bessarion was furious when he learned. He had been outmaneuvered. Moscow had taken the imperial bride and rejected the imperial church. But what could Rome do? Sofia was already married. She was already in Moscow, already pregnant with Ivan's child. The marriage itself was strategic, not romantic. The chronicles do not describe affection, they describe alliance. Sofia brought Byzantine titles, imperial symbolism, connection to the lost empire. Ivan brought power, wealth, a growing state. But Sofia brought something else, something more important than titles. She brought Italians. Sofia's entourage included Italian craftsmen, merchants, engineers, people from her years in Rome, people with skills Moscow lacked. Ivan noticed them, questioned them, learned what they could do. And he realized something. If he wanted to build an empire, he needed imperial architecture. The Moscow Kremlin in 1472 was wooden, part stone, but mostly wooden, functional, forgettable, not the seat of a power claiming Byzantine succession. Ivan needed something else, something that looked like power. In 1474, he sent an embassy to Italy, not to Rome this time, to Venice, Bologna, Florence. The embassy had one mission: recruit architects. They found Aristotele Fioravanti. Fioravanti was famous, genuinely famous. Not famous in the medieval sense, where famous meant known to other craftsmen. Famous in the Renaissance sense. His name appeared in chronicles, in letters, in city records across Italy. He had moved towers, literally, physically moved stone towers in Bologna, multiple towers. When they started leaning, Fioravanti devised pulley systems to straighten them. The physics were extraordinary. The engineering was unprecedented. He had built fortifications that resisted cannon, designed siege engines, advised cities on defensive architecture. He was 60 years old, wealthy, respected. Why would he go to Moscow? To a country he probably could not locate on a map, to work for a prince he had never heard of? The answer is in the contract. Ivan offered 10 rubles per month, an enormous salary, equivalent to what Moscow's highest boyars received, plus housing, plus supplies, plus complete authority over the project. No Muscovite officials second-guessing, no committee oversight. Fioravanti would design and build as he saw fit. For a Renaissance engineer, this was paradise. Complete creative control, unlimited budget, a patron who wanted grandeur and would not micromanage. Fioravanti arrived in Moscow in spring 1475. Ivan commissioned him to rebuild the Assumption Cathedral. The cathedral was Moscow's ceremonial center, where grand princes were crowned, where metropolitans were enthroned, where major state ceremonies occurred. The old cathedral was falling apart. Built in the 13th century, expanded in the 14th, it had structural problems. Cracks. Settling. Parts had collapsed in 1474. Fioravanti inspected the ruins. Then he traveled to Vladimir. Why Vladimir? Because Vladimir's Assumption Cathedral was the model. Built in the 12th century, it represented the height of pre-Mongol Russian architecture. White stone, golden domes, interior frescoes by Byzantine masters. It was what Russian cathedrals should look like. Fioravanti studied Vladimir's cathedral for weeks, measured it, sketched it, analyzed its proportions. Then he returned to Moscow and built something different. The new Assumption Cathedral looked Russian. 5 domes, white stone walls, zakomeri, the semicircular decorative elements. From outside, it was recognizably Rus, but the engineering was Italian. Fioravanti used brick for the interior structure. Brick was stronger than stone, allowed larger interior spaces, thinner walls, more light. He used iron tie rods, embedded in the walls, preventing cracking, distributing weight, a technique from Italian Renaissance architecture unknown in Rus. He designed the floor plan for acoustics. The vaults echoed chants perfectly. This was calculated, mathematical. Construction took 4 years, from 1475 to 1479. Fioravanti supervised personally, trained Muscovite workers in new techniques, imported materials, solved problems as they arose. The cathedral opened in August 1479. It was unlike anything in Rus. The interior space was vast, open. The walls seemed to float. Light flooded through windows. The acoustics made liturgical singing ethereal. This was not just a church, it was a statement. Moscow could build like Byzantium, like Italy. Moscow could be an imperial capital. But Fioravanti's real contribution was not the cathedral, it was military. In 1469, during construction, Ivan called Fioravanti to a meeting. There was a problem. Novgorod's walls. They were strong, stone, well-maintained. A siege would be expensive. Could artillery breach them? Fioravanti studied maps of Novgorod. Then he said yes, with proper guns, proper placement, proper ammunition. Yes. Ivan commissioned him to design siege cannon. Fioravanti built 6 large cannon, plus smaller pieces. He trained Muscovite crews, explained trajectories, angles, powder ratios. These cannon never fired at Novgorod. The city surrendered before siege became necessary. But Ivan kept the guns, kept the crews, kept learning. In 1487, Moscow besieged Kazan. Fioravanti's cannon breached the walls in 12 days. Walls that had resisted Moscow for decades, broken by Italian engineering in less than 2 weeks. Fioravanti died in Moscow in 1486, wealthy, honoured, buried in the city he had helped transform. But he was just the beginning. Other Italians followed: Marco Ruffo, Pietro Antonio Solari, Aloisio da Milano. They rebuilt the Kremlin walls. Between 1485 and 1495, the wooden fortifications were replaced with red brick. The distinctive crenellations, the swallowtail merlons, were copied from the Castello Sforzesco in Milan. Solari had worked there. He brought the design to Moscow. The Kremlin towers, the Spasskaya Tower, the Nikolskaya Tower. Italian design, Italian engineering, Russian names. The faceted chamber, Granovitaya Palata. Moscow's throne room, where Ivan received ambassadors. The interior vault was Venetian. The facade rustication was Florentine. The overall impression was imperial. By 1500, Moscow looked different. No longer a wooden fortress town, now a stone capital, with Italian gates, with Renaissance palaces, with engineering that rivaled Western European cities, and with one symbol that tied it all together, the double-headed eagle. The seal first appeared in 1497, on documents, on treaties, on coins. A double-headed eagle facing east and west, one crown above both heads, 3 crowns in later versions, clutching scepter and orb. Where did it come from? The official story, Sophia brought it from Byzantium. It was the Paleologos family crest. Through marriage, Ivan inherited the right to use it. This story is mostly false. The Paleologos family did use a double-headed eagle, but so did the Holy Roman Empire. So did various Italian city-states. The symbol was not specifically Byzantine, it was broadly imperial. Ivan chose it because it said, Moscow is an empire, Moscow is Rome's heir, Moscow faces both directions, east toward the steppe, west toward Europe. Moscow is the center. This was the ideology Sophia's marriage enabled, not through church union, that failed, but through symbolic appropriation. Moscow could not be the second Rome, that was Constantinople, and Constantinople fell in 1453. But if Constantinople fell because it betrayed orthodoxy, if the Byzantine acceptance of church union at the Council of Florence in 1439 doomed the empire, then Constantinople's fall was divine punishment, and Orthodox Russia could be the third Rome, the final Rome, the empire that would last until the end of the world. This theory was not invented by Ivan. It was formulated by the monk Philotheus of Pskov around 1510, after Ivan's death. But Ivan created the conditions for the theory. He married the Byzantine princess, he built the imperial capital, he adopted the imperial symbol, he constructed the architecture of empire, and he did it all by using Catholics to build Orthodox legitimacy, Italian engineers to create Russian grandeur, Renaissance techniques to establish medieval authority. Rome sent Sophia to convert Moscow. Moscow took Sophia and rejected Rome. It was the Novgorod strategy again. Take what is useful, discard the rest. Document nothing that could be used against you. By 1490, Ivan had built a state that looked eternal. Stone walls, cathedral domes, imperial eagles. But eternal states need eternal laws, and Ivan was about to write them. The cathedral domes gleamed gold above Moscow. The Kremlin walls rose red in Italian brick, and the double-headed eagle stared from every official seal. But symbols without systems are theatre. Ivan knew this. He had always known this. 1497, the year Russia received its name, its law, and its chains. On March 20th, 1497, a diplomatic letter left Moscow bound for the Holy Roman Emperor. The letter discussed trade routes, border disputes, mutual recognition, standard diplomatic correspondence, except for one word. The letter referred to Ivan's domain as Rossiya, Russia, not Rus, not the Russian lands, not Muscovy, Russia. A single word designating a single state with defined territory and unified governance. The document still exists. Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts. Collection 135, Document number 53. The handwriting is careful, formal. The seal is Ivan's double-headed eagle. And that word appears 3 times in the text. Россия. This was not the first time the word appeared. It had existed in church texts, in chronicles, as a poetic or theological term. But this was the first time it appeared in an official state document. The first time a ruler used it to describe his domain to a foreign power. Before 1497, diplomats wrote of the Grand Prince of Moscow and Vladimir and Novgorod and Tver and many other lands. A list, a catalogue of conquered territories. The formula was ancient, cumulative. Each new conquest added another title. After 1497, the formula simplified. The sovereign of all Russia. Государь всей России. Not a list, a totality. This shift was not linguistic decoration, it was conceptual revolution. A list of territories can be divided, can be apportioned among heirs, can fragment back into principalities. The Mongol Empire did this. The Carolingian Empire did this. Every medieval confederation eventually did this. But a named, unified state is indivisible. Russia is Russia. It cannot be split without ceasing to be itself. Ivan created the name to make division impossible, to ensure that what he built could not dissolve after his death. But a name without law is just a label. In September 1497, Ivan convened a legal council, boyars, church officials, senior dyaks. They met in the faceted chamber, the same Italian-designed throne room where Ivan received foreign ambassadors. The council's task? Codify Russian law. Create a unified legal code applicable across all territories. Replace the patchwork of local customs, princely decrees, and church regulations with a single system. This was unprecedented. Russian law until 1497 was based on Russkaya Pravda, Russian truth, a code from the 11th century, written under Yaroslav the Wise. It covered blood feuds, theft, property disputes, personal injuries. It was brilliant for its time. Detailed, practical, but it was 400 years old. It said nothing about state administration, nothing about service obligations, nothing about the relationship between prince and boyar, state and church, centre and provinces. The council worked for 3 months. The result was the Sudebnik of 1497. The Sudebnik contained 92 articles, short, concise. Each article addressed a specific legal issue, procedure in court cases, jurisdiction of different officials, fees for legal services, punishments for specific crimes. The code exists in multiple manuscript copies. The earliest is in the State Historical Museum in Moscow, 53 pages. Dense medieval script, marginal notes in different hands showing how later clerks interpreted ambiguous passages. Article 1 established court hierarchy. The Grand Prince's court was supreme. Boyar courts handled local disputes but could be appealed to Moscow. Church courts handled spiritual matters, but not civil or criminal cases involving lay people. Clear, unambiguous. Moscow at the top. Articles 2 through 15 defined procedures, how to summon defendants, what evidence was admissible, how to handle witnesses, what happened if a witness lied. These were technical, boring, essential, because before the Sudebnik, court procedure varied by location. Novgorod had different rules than Moscow. Tver had different rules than Ryazan. A merchant travelling between cities could not predict how disputes would be resolved. This made trade difficult, made contracts uncertain, made economic integration impossible. The Sudebnik standardised everything. One procedure, one set of rules, One legal reality from Novgorod to Kazan. Articles 16 through 30 covered crimes and punishments: murder, theft, arson, assault, standard criminal law, but with one innovation: the introduction of state crimes. Article 9 defined premeditated murder as a state offence, not a private wrong to be compensated by blood money, a crime against public order requiring state punishment. This was new. Under Russkaya Pravda, murder was a family matter. The killer's family paid the victim's family. The prince received a fine. Under the Sudebnik, murder was the state's concern. The state prosecuted. The state punished. The victim's family could not negotiate private settlement. This centralized violence made the state the sole legitimate user of force, transformed crime from private dispute into public disorder. Articles 31 through 55 addressed administration, salaries for officials, rules for tax collection, procedures for appealing administrative decisions. Article 38 introduced the formal role of diaks, scribes, as professional administrators. Before the Sudebnik, diaks were clerks, record keepers. After the Sudebnik, they were officials with defined powers. They could witness contracts, certify documents, investigate disputes. This created bureaucracy, permanent, professional, not dependent on individual boyars, but on institutional position. Ivan was replacing personal loyalty with systemic function. A diak served the office, not the prince, and the office outlasted any individual prince. Then came Article 57. Article 57 defined peasant movement rights. It stated, peasants could leave their landlord's estate once per year, during a 2-week period, 1 week before St. George's Day, Yuriev Day, in autumn, and 1 week after. The date was November 26th. Why that date? Because harvest was finished, fields were empty, winter had not yet made travel impossible. It was the agricultural dead zone, the one time peasants could move without disrupting production. To leave, a peasant had to pay departure fee, pozheloya. The amount depended on location and duration of residence. 1 ruble in open field regions, half a ruble in forested regions, plus additional fees if the peasant had borrowed money or tools from the landlord. 1 ruble was expensive, very expensive. A typical peasant family's annual cash income was perhaps 2 to 3 rubles. Paying 1 ruble meant saving for years, but it was possible, legally possible. A peasant who saved, who worked, who avoided debt, that peasant could move, could seek better land, better terms, could escape an abusive landlord. Article 57 was not the beginning of serfdom. It was actually the documentation of freedom, limited freedom, expensive freedom, but real freedom. Before the Sudebnik, peasant mobility was customary, varied by region. Some landlords allowed movement, others did not. There was no written standard. The Sudebnik created the standard, and by creating it, by writing it down, by making it law, Ivan also created the mechanism for its eventual elimination. Because once the right to move was written in law, it could be modified by law, restricted by law, eventually abolished by law. This would not happen under Ivan. It would happen under his successors, gradually, first restricting movement for indebted peasants, then requiring landlord permission, then eliminating Yuriev Day entirely. By the mid-16th century, Russian peasants were serfs, bound to land, owned, effectively, by landlords. But the process started in 1497, started with documentation, started with Article 57. Ivan did not intend to create serfdom. He intended to create order, to make movement predictable, to prevent landlords from stealing each other's peasants by offering better terms, to stabilize rural labor supply. Rational goals, reasonable administration, catastrophic consequences. The Sudebnik went into effect on January 1st, 1498. Copies were sent to every major city, to governors, to church officials, to boyar estates, and enforcement began immediately. The key to enforcement was documentation. Every court case had to be recorded, every verdict written down, every appeal documented. The Dyaks kept registers, thick books recording thousands of cases, property disputes, criminal trials, administrative appeals. These registers still exist, scattered across Russian archives, fragmentary, but enough to reconstruct how the system worked. Disputes that previously would have been resolved informally, a boyar's word, a priest's mediation, a village elder's judgment, now went to court, where they were written down, where they created precedent, where they built a body of case law interpreting the Sudebnik's 92 articles. This was Ivan's method again. Transform informal power into documented process. Make everything visible. Make everything recordable. Make everything controllable. But legal codes and administrative reforms are invisible to most people. Peasants did not read the Sudebnik. Merchants experienced its effects but did not study its text. What mattered to contemporaries was symbolism, ceremony, display. In August 1498, Ivan held a ceremony in the new Assumption Cathedral. He crowned his grandson. Not his son, his grandson. This requires explanation. Ivan's first son, Ivan Ivanovich, Ivan the Young, was born in 1468, from Ivan's first marriage to Maria of Tver. The boy grew up as heir, trained in administration, led minor military campaigns, married Elena Stefanovna, daughter of the Moldavian prince Stefan the Great. They had a son, Dmitri, born in 1483. In 1490, Ivan the Young died. The chronicles say he died of illness, lomota v nogach, pain in the legs. Modern historians speculate gout, or some form of joint disease, or poison. The chronicles are vague. He was treated by a physician, Maestro Leon, an Italian Jew from Venice. Leon treated the prince with medicinal applications, hot compresses, herbal preparations. Then, something more drastic. The chronicles describe it as sklanki, glass vessels filled with hot water applied to the skin. Cupping, a common medieval treatment. The treatment failed. Ivan the Young's condition worsened. He died on March 7th, 1490. 4 days later, Leon was executed, beheaded in public, for failing to save the heir. The execution was officially described as punishment for incompetence, but executing a doctor for losing a patient was unusual, unless the court suspected something worse than incompetence. Poison rumors circulated immediately, not recorded in official chronicles, but preserved in foreign accounts, in letters from merchants, in later compilations of court gossip. Who would poison the heir? The obvious suspect, Sofia Palaiologina, because Sophia had a son, Vasily, born in 1479, from her marriage to Ivan. As long as Ivan the Young lived, Vasily was a spare heir, second in line, irrelevant. But if Ivan the Young died, the succession became complicated. Should the throne pass to Ivan the Young's son Dmitri, the dead heir's heir, or to Ivan's living son Vasily, the Grand Prince's son from his second marriage? Traditional succession favoured Dmitri, grandson through the first son, direct line, but Vasily was older, 19 in 1490. Dmitri was 7, and Vasily had Sophia's support. Sophia had spent 18 years in Moscow building networks, cultivating boyars, distributing patronage. She had Italian connections, Byzantine prestige. She was politically formidable. Elena Stefanovna, Dmitri's mother, was Moldovan, foreign, less connected, weaker. The poison theory is unprovable, no evidence beyond circumstantial timing, but circumstantial timing is all conspiracy theories need to survive. What is certain, Ivan faced a succession crisis. In February 1498, he announced his decision. Dmitri would be heir. Dmitri would be crowned co-ruler. The dynasty would continue through Ivan the Young's line. Sophia was furious. The chronicles do not record her reaction directly, but they record her absence from Dmitri's coronation ceremony. She refused to attend. On February 4th, 1498, Metropolitan Simon crowned Dmitri in the Assumption Cathedral, Fioravanti's cathedral. The ceremony was elaborate, borrowed from Byzantine ritual. The crown, the scepter, the orb, all the symbols of imperial authority. Dmitri was 15 years old. The coronation should have resolved the succession, should have made Dmitri's position secure. It did not. Because while Ivan was building legal codes and crowning grandsons, a religious crisis was splitting the Russian church. The heresy of the Judaizers, Yeres Zhidovstvuyushchich. The movement began in Novgorod in the 1470s, before Moscow's final conquest. A group of clergy and educated lay people began questioning Orthodox doctrine. They questioned the Trinity, argued that God was one, not three persons. They questioned icons, argued that worshipping images was idolatry. They questioned church hierarchy, argued that priests were unnecessary intermediaries. They studied Hebrew texts, Jewish commentaries, calculated that the world should have ended in 1492, 7,000 years after creation by Byzantine reckoning, and when it did not end, questioned Orthodox chronology. These ideas were not Judaism. They were Christian heresy influenced by Jewish theological arguments. The movement's members were Christians who doubted official doctrine, not converts to Judaism, but they were called Judaizers because they used Jewish sources, because questioning the Trinity echoed Jewish monotheism, because the accusation, Judaizer, was simpler than explaining complex theological disputes. The movement spread from Novgorod to Moscow in the 1480s. Some of Ivan's own court officials were involved. Fyodor Kurytsin, Ivan's senior diplomat, head of the Foreign Affairs Department, translator, intellectual, one of the most educated men in Russia. Kurytsin had traveled widely, to Hungary, to Moldavia, to Italy. He spoke Latin, Greek, German. He translated philosophical texts. He corresponded with European scholars, and he sympathized with the Judaizers. Not openly. Kurytsin was too intelligent for open heresy, but in private discussions, in letters that were later discovered, in his patronage of other suspected heretics. Elena Stefanovna, Dmitri's mother, was also suspected. Her spiritual advisor was a priest named Alexei. Alexei was documented as a Judaizer, openly questioned Orthodox doctrine. Elena protected him, refused to dismiss him even when church officials complained. This created a political problem. If Dmitri became Grand Prince, his mother Elena would be de facto regent. He was young, inexperienced. She would guide policy. And if Elena was protecting heretics, if her advisors were Judaizers, if her circle questioned Orthodox doctrine, what would happen to the Russian church? The church hierarchy panicked. Gennadius, Archbishop of Novgorod, began compiling evidence of heresy, letters, witness testimony, doctrinal statements. He sent reports to Moscow, demanded action, demanded a church council to condemn the heretics, demanded executions. Ivan resisted. For years. Why? Because the heretics included useful people. Kuritsyn was irreplaceable as diplomat. Alexei was Elena's trusted advisor. Moving against them meant destabilizing Dmitri's support network. But by 1500, the pressure was overwhelming. Gennadius had catalogued too much evidence. The heresy was too widespread. The church was threatening schism if Ivan did not act. In September 1500, Ivan convened a church council, the Council of 1500. The council met in Moscow. Bishops, abbots, senior clergy. They reviewed evidence, interrogated suspects, debated theology. The proceedings were documented, a thick manuscript still preserved in church archives. Hundreds of pages, testimony, confessions extracted under pressure, theological arguments. The council condemned the Judaizers, declared their doctrines heretical, ordered their punishment. In December 1500, the first executions for religious heresy in Russian history took place in Moscow. Not burnings, that was Catholic practice. Orthodox Russia used different methods. The condemned were placed in wooden cages. The cages were displayed in public squares, then set on fire. The victims burned inside the cages, slowly. Chronicles record 3 executions, 3 men, burned in cages in Moscow's central square. Others were exiled, imprisoned in monasteries, forced to recant publicly. Fyodor Kuritsyn disappeared from records in 1501. No execution documented, no exile recorded, simply gone. Probably died in prison, quietly, without ceremony. Elena's advisor Alexei was imprisoned, died in captivity within a year. Elena herself was not charged, too dangerous. She was the mother of the crowned heir. But her support network was destroyed, her advisors eliminated. She was isolated, powerless. And in 1501, Dmitri's position collapsed. On April 11, 1502, Ivan arrested Dmitri, not for heresy, for conspiracy. The charges were vague: plotting against the sovereign, seeking to usurp power before Ivan's death. No trial, no public evidence. Dmitri was simply removed, imprisoned in the Kremlin, his crown taken away, his title revoked. 4 days later, on April 15, 1502, Ivan crowned Vasily. Sophia had won. Not through poison, though the rumor never died. Not through open conflict. Through patience. Through building networks. Through waiting for her enemies to destroy themselves. The heresy crisis eliminated Dmitri's support structure, made him politically vulnerable, made switching heirs feasible. Dmitri remained imprisoned until 1509. Then he died, age 26. Cause of death, unrecorded. Elena outlived her son by 1 year, died in 1510, also in captivity, also under mysterious circumstances. Vasily became Vasily III. He ruled from 1505 to 1533, 28 years. He continued his father's policies: centralization, bureaucratization, expansion. And his son was Ivan, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. This is the line that survived. This is the dynasty that history remembers. The line through Sophia Paleologina, the line through Vasily, the line through the succession that destroyed Dmitri. And because this line survived, it wrote the history. Chronicles were edited. Vasily III ordered revisions. emphasizing his legitimacy, downplaying Dmitri, portraying Elena as heretic sympathizer, portraying Sophia as righteous Byzantine princess. By the time Ivan the Terrible took power in 1533, the story of Dmitri's coronation and fall had been simplified, reduced to a footnote, a minor succession dispute, unimportant. But it was not unimportant. It was the hinge. Because if Dmitri had remained heir, if Elena's faction had survived, if the heresy crisis had resolved differently, Russian history would have been different, perhaps more tolerant. The Judaizers represented intellectual openness, questioning, engagement with non-orthodox ideas, perhaps more connected to Europe. Dmitri's advisors included Western-educated intellectuals. Perhaps. But perhaps is not history. History is what happened. What happened? Ivan III's grandson was destroyed. Ivan III's second son took power. And that son's son became Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar who killed his own son, who terrorized the nobility, who created the oprichnina, state within a state, who made terror systematic. Ivan III built the architecture of the Russian state. Vasily III maintained it. Ivan the Terrible filled it with blood. And in that blood, Ivan III disappeared. Because how do you remember a builder when his grandson is a monster? How do you celebrate systematic governance when the system produces systematic terror? How do you praise the man who created the framework when the framework enables atrocity? 1497 gave Russia its name, its law, its trajectory. And 50 years later, that trajectory led to the oprichnina, to the sack of Novgorod under Ivan the Terrible, burning what Ivan III had merely conquered, to the murder of Metropolitan Philip for opposing the Tsar, to the killing of Tsarevich Ivan by his father's hand. The year a country was born was also the year it was cursed, not by Ivan III's intention, by the logic of what he built. A state with no alternatives, no checks, no balances, no mechanism to limit power except the sovereign's self-restraint. Novgorod's Vech had been a check, eliminated. The appanage princes had been alternatives, absorbed. The church had been independent, subordinated through heresy trials. What remained was pure autocracy, one will, one voice, one state, efficient, powerful, expandable, dangerous. Ivan III died on October 27, 1505. He was 65. He had ruled for 43 years. The chronicles record his death clinically: illness, decline, last confession, burial in the Archangel Cathedral, no emotion, no evaluation, just facts. Because by 1505, chroniclers already knew what was coming: Vasily's reign, Ivan the Terrible's childhood, the future that Ivan III had built but would not see. And they knew that judging him was impossible. He had freed Russia from the horde. He had unified the lands. He had created the legal code. He had built the capital. He had established the state. But he had also eliminated alternatives, concentrated power, created mechanisms that would enable future terror. Was he great? Was he terrible? Was he both? Neither? The chronicles did not answer. They simply recorded, and then forgot. Because remembering Ivan III meant remembering that Russian autocracy was not inevitable, was not natural, was not divine. It was built by a man, with documents and deportations and Italian architects. And if it was built, it could be questioned. Better to forget the builder. Ivan III was buried in the Archangel Cathedral on November 2nd, 1505. The funeral was attended by Vasily, now Grand Prince, by Metropolitan Simon, by the Boyar Council, by foreign ambassadors who had known Ivan for decades. The service lasted 4 hours. Incense filled the Italian-designed cathedral. prayers echoed through Fioravanti's acoustically perfect vaults. Within a year, his name began disappearing. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, methodically, through 3 separate processes of historical erasure that occurred over 2 centuries, each for different reasons, each serving different political needs, but all converging on the same result. The man who built Russia vanished from Russian memory. The first erasure was personal. Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, became Grand Prince in 1533. He was 3 years old. His father, Vasily III, had died suddenly, probably poisoned, though the chronicles are cautious. Russia entered a regency period, boyar factions fighting for control, the child prince powerless. Ivan grew up watching aristocrats murder each other, watching his mother, Elena Glinskaya, struggle to maintain authority until her own suspicious death in 1538 when Ivan was 8. Watching rival boyar clans, the Shuiskys, the Belskys, use him as legitimizing symbol while ignoring his actual power. He was crowned Tsar in 1547, 16 years old. The coronation ceremony borrowed heavily from Byzantine ritual. The title Tsar, Caesar, had been used informally by his grandfather. Ivan IV made it official. He was not Grand Prince, he was Tsar of all Russia. For the first decade, his reign was productive. Legal reforms, administrative reorganization, military victories. The conquest of Kazan in 1552, the conquest of Astrakhan in 1556, the complete destruction of what remained of Mongol power in the Volga region. Then, in 1560, his wife Anastasia died. Ivan believed she was poisoned by boyars, by enemies, by conspirators who wanted to weaken him. Whether this was true is debatable, but Ivan believed it, and belief shapes action. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina, a state within the state, a separate administration, a personal territory carved out of Russia and governed directly by the Tsar through his own hand-picked officials, the Oprichniki. The Oprichniki wore black, rode black horses, carried symbols of a broom and a dog's head on their saddles. The symbolism? Sweep away treason, bite the Tsar's enemies. What they actually did was terror. Arbitrary arrests, confiscation of property, torture, public executions, mass killings. The Oprichniki operated outside normal law. They answered only to Ivan. They were judge, jury, executioner. Boyar families were destroyed. Not just individuals, entire families, wives, children, servants, anyone connected to suspected traitors. The definition of treason was flexible. Looking at the Tsar wrong could be treason. Owning too much land could be treason. Having ancestors who once supported the wrong faction could be treason. In 1570, Ivan decided Novgorod was treasonous. Not individual Novgorodians, the entire city. The accusation? Novgorod planned to defect to Poland-Lithuania. Evidence was thin. A letter, possibly forged, testimony from tortured prisoners. But evidence did not matter. Ivan believed Novgorod was disloyal. In January 1570, Ivan marched on Novgorod with the Oprichniki, between 2,000 and 15,000 soldiers. The chronicles disagree on numbers. They surrounded the city. Then they entered. What followed was not conquest. It was massacre. The Oprichniki went house to house. They killed systematically. Men, women, children. The chronicles describe bodies thrown into the Volkhov River until the river was dammed with corpses. How many died? The chronicles disagree wildly. Some say 3,000, some say 15,000, Some say 60,000. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 2 and 15,000 deaths. Even the low estimate is catastrophic. Novgorod in 1570 had maybe 30,000 people. 2,000 dead means nearly 10% of the population killed in 6 weeks. 15,000 means half. Ivan III had conquered Novgorod. Ivan IV drowned it in blood. And this created a problem for Ivan IV, because his grandfather had also dealt with Novgorod, but differently, without mass killing, through deportation, through administration, through boring, effective, non-theatrical governance. The comparison made Ivan IV look unstable, made his terror look excessive, made his methods look like the actions of a madman rather than a sovereign. So Ivan IV edited the chronicles, literally, personally. The scholar Dmitry Likachev analyzed chronicle manuscripts in the 1960s. He identified handwriting, cross-referenced with known samples of Ivan IV's writing. The match was certain. Ivan IV personally revised chronicle entries about his grandfather. He did not remove Ivan III entirely. That would be too obvious, too suspicious. Instead, he minimized. He reduced detailed descriptions of Ivan III's campaigns to brief summaries. He removed sections praising Ivan III's administrative reforms. He added marginal notes emphasizing Ivan III's military victories while downplaying diplomatic successes. The goal was clear: make Ivan III look like a warrior prince, strong, aggressive, conquering, not a bureaucrat, not a patient diplomatist, not someone who won through waiting and calculation. Because if Ivan III was remembered as effective through patience, then Ivan IV's impatience looked like failure. If Ivan III was remembered as building through law, then Ivan IV's rule through terror looked like destruction. Better to simplify grandfather into warrior. Then grandson's violence becomes continuation, not aberration. The chronicles also downplayed Ivan III's relationship with the church, the Judaizer controversy, the execution of heretics. Ivan IV wanted to be seen as the first Tsar to defend orthodoxy through violence. If his grandfather had already done this, the claim weakened. So the Judaizer persecutions were minimized in the chronicles, reduced to a few sentences, a minor theological dispute, nothing comparable to Ivan IV's own religious terror. Ivan IV also edited references to the succession crisis, Dmitri's coronation, his fall, the conflict between Elena and Sophia. These passages were politically dangerous. They showed that Tsarist succession was not inevitable, that there had been alternatives, that the line leading to Ivan IV had won through political maneuvering, not divine right. Better to simplify. Vasily was the legitimate heir. Dmitri was a pretender. Elena was a heretic sympathizer who endangered orthodoxy. The succession was clear, ordained by God. Chronicle revision was not unique to Ivan IV. Medieval rulers routinely influenced historical writing, but Ivan IV's intervention was unusually direct, unusually personal, unusually thorough. And it worked. By 1600, the dominant narrative of Ivan III was Ivan IV's version. Warrior prince, conqueror of Novgorod, liberator from the Mongols, strong but simple, effective but not complex. The bureaucrat vanished, the patient diplomat vanished, the man who built the state through documents and deportations vanished. What remained was a predecessor, a warm-up act for the real Tsar, the terrible one. The second erasure was imperial. Peter I became Tsar in 1682. He was 10 years old. He ruled jointly with his half-brother Ivan V, sick, possibly mentally disabled, certainly uninterested in governance. Real power was held by regents until Peter seized control in 1689. Peter was obsessed with the West, with technology, with modernity, with transforming Russia from a medieval backwater into a European power. He toured Europe incognito in 1697 and 1698, worked in Dutch shipyards, studied English naval architecture, met with German princes, visited Italian workshops, absorbed Western techniques. He returned to Russia determined to westernize everything: the beard tax, the calendar reform, the creation of the Russian Navy, the founding of St. Petersburg in 1703, a new capital, Western in design, built on swampland through forced labor that killed thousands. The table of ranks in 1722, replacing hereditary aristocracy with meritocratic service hierarchy. The subordination of the Orthodox Church to state control. Peter's reforms were real, transformative. They genuinely modernized Russia, made it a European power, enabled military victories over Sweden, established Russian presence on the Baltic. But they also required a narrative. Peter's narrative. Russia before me was backward, isolated, medieval, ignorant of the West. I opened the window to Europe. I dragged Russia into modernity. I am the first modern Russian ruler. This narrative had a problem. Ivan III. Because Ivan III had already hired Italians, had already built with Western techniques, had already engaged with European powers diplomatically, had already integrated Western military technology, had already created a bureaucratic state based partly on Western administrative models. If Ivan III was remembered accurately, Peter could not claim to be first, could not claim to have uniquely opened Russia to Europe. So Peter's official historians minimized Ivan III. They did not deny his existence. They acknowledged he unified Russia, freed it from the Mongols, conquered Novgorod. These were undeniable. But they portrayed him as operating within a purely Russian context, as having no significant Western contacts, as being isolated from Europe, as ruling a medieval state through medieval methods. The Italian architects? Mentioned rarely, portrayed as hired craftsmen, not cultural influences. Their work was acknowledged, but its implications ignored. The diplomatic correspondence with the Holy Roman Empire? Simplified or omitted. Peter's historians emphasized Ivan III's conflicts with Lithuania and Poland, his rivals, while downplaying his negotiations with German princes, Italian city-states, the Pope. The Sudebnik? Mentioned as a legal code but not analyzed, its similarities to Western European legal reforms, the professionalization of bureaucracy, the standardization of procedure, were not emphasized. Why? Because acknowledging these connections would undermine Peter's uniqueness. Peter was not the first to westernize. He was the most dramatic, the most theatrical, the most violent. He did in decades what Ivan III had done subtly over decades, but he was not first. Petrine historians solved this by making Ivan III boring, a competent medieval prince, a successful conqueror, but not a visionary, not a transformer, not someone who fundamentally changed Russia's relationship with Europe. This version persisted for 2 centuries, through Catherine the Great's reign, through the 19th century. Ivan III was acknowledged in histories, but never celebrated, never made heroic, never given the credit Peter received. Peter had monuments, had cities named after him, had anniversaries, had commemorations, had a mythology. Ivan III had footnotes. The Third Erasure was ideological. The Soviet Union was founded in 1922. The Bolsheviks needed historical precedents, heroes who demonstrated that Russia's destiny was revolutionary, that autocracy was doomed, that the people's struggle against oppression was ancient and inevitable. Soviet historians evaluated Russian history through class struggle. Good rulers were those who advanced historical progress. Bad rulers were those who defended exploitation. This created categories. Good, rulers who centralized state power against feudal fragmentation. Bad, rulers who defended aristocratic privilege. Good, Rulers who expanded Russian territory and protected it from foreign invasion. Bad. Rulers who oppressed the peasantry. Ivan III fit awkwardly. He centralized state power. Good. He defeated the Mongols. Good. He unified Russian lands. Good. But he also created the legal foundation for serfdom. Bad. He eliminated Novgorod's democratic institutions. Very bad. He strengthened autocracy. Extremely bad. Soviet historians struggled with this. Some tried to portray Ivan III as progressive for his time. He unified Russia, which was objectively necessary for historical development. He broke boyar power, which was proto-revolutionary. He created a strong state, which later enabled Peter's modernization, which eventually led to industrialization, which created the proletariat, which made revolution possible. This interpretation was tortured, unconvincing. It made Ivan III an accidental hero, someone who advanced history without intending to, someone who built autocracy but somehow contributed to its eventual overthrow. Other historians emphasized his negative role. He oppressed peasants, eliminated democratic alternatives, created the legal infrastructure of feudal exploitation. But this created a different problem. If Ivan III was simply an oppressor, why did he succeed? Why did the oppressed not rebel? Why did Russian history proceed toward greater autocracy rather than popular resistance? The question was dangerous, because it suggested that autocracy might be stable, might be popular even, might be something other than a system sustained only through violence against the people's will. Soviet historians preferred clear narratives: good revolutionaries versus bad reactionaries, progressive forces versus backward forces, the people struggling toward liberation. Ivan III fit none of these narratives cleanly. He was not a revolutionary. He was not a reactionary defending feudalism against progress. He actively transformed feudalism into something new. He was not obviously on the people's side. Article 57 began the process towards serfdom, but he was not obviously against them either. He created legal stability, economic growth, territorial security. He was a technocrat, an administrator, a builder of systems, and Soviet ideology had no category for effective technocrats who were neither heroes nor villains. So Soviet historians did what their Tsarist predecessors had done. They acknowledged Ivan III briefly, noted his conquests, mentioned the end of Mongol rule, then moved on to more ideologically useful figures. Alexander Nevsky, defender against foreign invasion, hero. Ivan the Terrible, complicated but at least theatrical, at least someone whose violence could be debated. Peter I, modernizer, industrializer, someone who pushed Russia toward the conditions that would eventually produce socialism. Ivan III, builder of the state. Which state? The autocratic state, the state that would oppress workers and peasants for 4 more centuries. Better to minimize him. By the mid-20th century, 3 separate historical projects had converged. Ivan IV wanted to eliminate a predecessor who made him look unstable. Peter wanted to eliminate a predecessor who made him look derivative. The Soviets wanted to eliminate a figure who did not fit ideological categories. 3 different motivations, 3 different eras, same result: erasure. Not complete erasure. Ivan III remained in textbooks, in academic histories, in specialized studies. Historians knew who he was, what he accomplished. But popular memory, cultural mythology, national identity, gone. Ask a Russian schoolchild about Ivan the Terrible. They know stories: the oprichnina, the killing of his son, the brutality, the madness. Ask about Peter the Great. They know the beard tax, the new capital, the westernization, the table of ranks. Ask about Ivan III. Silence. Maybe he freed Russia from the Mongols? Uncertain. A guess. The man who built Russia is unknown to Russians. This is not accident. This is not natural historical forgetting. This is systematic erasure across 5 centuries by rulers who needed him forgotten for their own legitimacy. But there is a deeper reason, a reason that none of the 3 erasure projects acknowledged, but all implicitly understood. Ivan III proved that Russian autocracy was a choice. He eliminated alternatives deliberately, methodically, with full knowledge that alternatives existed and worked. Novgorod's Vecher was not a failed experiment. It was a functioning system that he destroyed. He created serfdom deliberately. Article 57 was not an accident. It was policy, rational policy for state building, catastrophic policy for human freedom. But conscious policy. He built the legal and administrative framework that enabled all future autocracy, the bureaucracy, the centralized law, the service nobility, the subordination of church to state, the elimination of alternative power centers. Every autocratic excess of every future ruler operated within the framework Ivan III built. Ivan the Terrible's oprichnina was possible because Ivan III eliminated institutional constraints on central power. Peter's forced modernization was possible because Ivan III created a state that could mobilize resources regardless of popular consent. Soviet totalitarianism was possible because Ivan III established that Russian governance meant absolute central authority with no structural limitations. If Russians remembered Ivan III clearly, they would have to confront this. They would have to acknowledge that autocracy was not natural, not inevitable, not something that just happened to Russia due to geography or culture or Mongol influence. It was built by a specific man, using specific techniques, making specific choices. And if it was built by choice, it could have been built differently. This is the thought that every Russian autocrat, from Ivan IV through the Soviet general secretaries, found intolerable. Better to forget the builder. Better to make autocracy seem ancient, eternal, Russian, inevitable. Better to remember the dramatic autocrats, the terrible one, the great one, the ones who seemed larger than life, whose rule seemed like destiny rather than choice. Better to forget the administrator who proved that states are made, not born. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia became, briefly, a democracy, sort of, chaotic, corrupt, unstable, but with elections, with opposition parties, with free press, with alternatives, for about 10 years. Then, Vladimir Putin centralized power, eliminated opposition, subordinated courts to executive, controlled media, created a service elite dependent on presidential patronage, built a state where alternatives were systematically eliminated. The methods were modern. Elections were held, but results predetermined. Opposition existed, but was marginalized through legal manipulation rather than outright prohibition. Media operated, but within understood limits. But the structure was familiar. Central autocrat, service nobility, bureaucratic control, no institutional limitations on executive power, no alternative power centers. Ivan III's model, updated, refined, but recognizable. And still, Russians do not remember Ivan III, because remembering him would mean acknowledging that this structure is not inevitable, is not natural, is not uniquely suited to Russia's character or circumstances. It is a choice, made 500 years ago, remade repeatedly since. A choice that could be unmade. But choices that can be unmade are dangerous to power. Safer to forget that choices were ever made. Safer to treat the present as inevitable consequence of eternal Russian character. Safer to bury the architect. In 2003, on the anniversary of Moscow's founding, the city erected statues of historical figures: Peter the Great, Catherine, Yuri Dolgoruki, Alexander Nevsky. Even Ivan the Terrible received a monument in Oryol. Ivan III received nothing. In 2007, a poll asked Russians to name the greatest figures in Russian history. Stalin topped the list. Lenin, Peter, Alexander Nevsky, Pushkin. Ivan III was not mentioned. Not once. The man who built the state that all these figures governed or influenced or died in, forgotten. Because systems are harder to remember than catastrophes. Everyone remembers Yuriev Day, November 26th, the peasants' last day of freedom, the beginning of serfdom, the chains closing. But who remembers the man who forged the chains? Everyone remembers the Oprichnina, the terror, the black-clad riders, the massacres. But who remembers the man who built the state that made the Oprichnina possible? Everyone remembers Peter's forced modernization, the violence of westernization, the thousands dead building St. Petersburg. But who remembers the man who created the administrative capacity that enabled Peter to mobilize resources on that scale? We remember the spectacles, the horrors, the drama. We forget the infrastructure. And perhaps that is the final reason Ivan III disappeared, not because autocrats erased him, not because historians minimized him, not because ideology could not categorize him, but because humans remember stories, not systems. Remember heroes and villains, not administrators. Remember the moment of liberation or catastrophe, not the decades of patient construction that made them possible. Ivan III's life was not a story. It was a process. He did not fight dramatic battles. He outlasted enemies. He did not give stirring speeches. He wrote detailed instructions to bureaucrats. He did not perform grand gestures. He signed documents. 50 years of documents, 50 years of patience, 50 years of systematic elimination of alternatives. And at the end, Russia. The Russia that would last in various forms until 1991. The Russia that would oppress millions, that would produce Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky and Mendeleev, that would defeat Napoleon and lose to Japan and collapse into revolution and rebuild as superpower. All of it built on foundations laid by a man whose name most Russians do not know. There is no grand conspiracy, no secret cabal keeping Ivan III's memory suppressed. There is only the accumulated weight of 5 centuries of people who found it convenient to forget him, and the uncomfortable truth that what he built still stands. On October 27th, 1505, Ivan III died in his bed. Not in battle, not by assassination, not in theatrical agony. He died the way administrators die, quietly, after long illness, surrounded by priests and family members who had already negotiated the succession. The practical details had been handled weeks earlier. His body was prepared for burial according to Orthodox ritual, washed, wrapped in a burial shroud, placed in a wooden coffin. The coffin was carried to the Archangel Cathedral, the same cathedral where his father Vasily the Blind was buried, where his son Ivan the Young was buried, where the dynasty's dead accumulated like documents in an archive. Metropolitan Simon conducted the funeral. The liturgy lasted 4 hours. The cathedral was crowded. Boyars, diplomats, clergy, merchants, foreign ambassadors who had negotiated with Ivan for decades stood alongside Muscovite officials who had implemented his orders. Then they buried him. Lowered the coffin into a tomb in the cathedral floor, sealed it with a stone slab, carved his name and dates into the slab. Ivan Vasilievich, Grand Prince of Moscow, born 1440, died 1505, 65 years. The inscription did not say founder of Russia, did not say liberator from the Mongols, did not say builder of the state, just his name, his title, his dates, as if he were merely one more prince in a long succession of princes, as if his 43-year reign had been ordinary, as if what he built could be taken for granted. Within months, Vasily III began issuing decrees in his own name, continuing policies, expanding territories, governing the state his father had constructed. The mechanisms worked smoothly, the bureaucracy functioned, the system operated whether or not anyone remembered who designed it. This was Ivan III's final achievement. He built a system that did not require memory of its builder to function. And because it did not require memory, memory faded. But there is one place where Ivan III's ghost lingers, one document that preserves not his achievements, but his method, one source that shows how he thought, how he operated, how he understood power. The document is a letter, written in 1496, 1 year before the Sudebnik, 1 year before Russia received its name. The letter is addressed to the abbot of the Kirillov monastery, a routine communication about monastery lands, a dispute over tax obligations. The monastery claims certain exemptions. Ivan's local officials rejected the claim. The abbot appealed to the Grand Prince. Standard medieval bureaucracy. Ivan's response still exists. State Archive. Fond 135. 12 pages. Dense script. The letter does not begin with grand pronouncements. It begins with a reference number, a citation of the previous correspondence, a precise summary of the dispute. Then it provides Ivan's decision. The monastery's claim is partially valid. According to a grant issued by Ivan's father in 1458, certain lands were exempt. But the grant specified exemptions for lands currently held by the monastery in 1458. The monastery had since acquired additional lands. Those new lands did not fall under the original exemption. The letter cites the original grant, quotes the relevant passage, explains the legal reasoning, specifies exactly which lands are exempt and which are not, provides a formula for calculating tax obligations on the non-exempt lands. Then it addresses the monastery's secondary argument. The monastery claimed that previous grand princes had interpreted the exemption broadly. That custom supported their position. Ivan's response is devastating. He acknowledges that previous interpretations may have been broad, but previous interpretations were not written down, were not formalized, were not law. Custom is not law. Precedent without documentation is not precedent. Only written grants have legal force. The letter concludes with instructions. The abbot must accept this decision, must instruct monastery officials to comply, must submit a written acknowledgement of receipt and acceptance. Failure to comply will result in investigation by Moscow's officials. The entire letter is 10 pages of legal reasoning, precise, detailed, boring, and it reveals everything. Ivan III did not govern through charisma, through intimidation, through appeals to tradition or divine right or personal loyalty. He governed through process, through documentation, through the patient accumulation of written decisions that, over time, became law. This letter is one of thousands. Ivan's chancery produced approximately 15,000 documents per year by the end of his reign. Letters, decrees, land grants, tax assessments, court decisions, treaties, instructions to officials, responses to petitions. 15,000 documents per year. 43 years of rule. Approximately 645,000 documents. Most are lost. Fires, wars, deliberate destruction. Medieval paper does not survive 5 centuries easily, but enough survive to reconstruct the system. And what the system reveals is that Ivan III was not governing Russia. He was administering it. There is a difference. Governance is political. It involves negotiation, compromise, building coalitions, responding to pressure. Governance is dynamic, interactive. Administration is technical. It involves procedure, documentation, implementation of predetermined rules. Administration is static, systematic. Ivan III transformed Russian government from political to administrative. He did this by making everything written, by creating procedures for everything, by training a class of officials, the dyaks, whose entire identity was procedural expertise. A dyak did not ask, "What does the prince want?" A dyak asked, "What does the regulation specify?" This seems like a minor distinction. It is not. When power is personal, it dies with the person. When power is procedural, it outlives everyone. Ivan the Terrible could massacre thousands because the administrative machinery his grandfather built kept functioning. The dyaks kept records. The tax collectors kept collecting. The courts kept judging. The system operated even while the sovereign went insane. Peter I could conscript millions for his wars because the service obligations Ivan III formalized in the Sudebnik created a mechanism for mobilization. Peter did not invent forced service. He inherited it. He expanded it. But the foundation was Ivan's. The Soviet state could implement central planning across 11 time zones because the tradition of central bureaucratic administration was 500 years old. Stalin did not create bureaucratic tyranny from nothing. He industrialized it. But the concept that the center could know everything, control everything, document everything, that concept was Ivan III's. This is why he had to be forgotten. Not because he was evil, not because his achievements were shameful, but because he proved that Russian autocracy was bureaucratic, not heroic. Russians can admire Ivan the Terrible despite his madness, because madness is dramatic. It suggests that autocracy requires extraordinary individuals, superhuman will, terrifying power. Russians can admire Peter the Great despite his violence, because the violence served modernization. It suggests that autocracy can be progressive, can be transformative, can be necessary. But Ivan III cannot be admired the same way, because Ivan III was not extraordinary. He was competent. He was patient. He was methodical. He was boring. And if boring competence can build an autocratic state, then autocracy is not special, is not unique. Is not the product of Russian character or historical destiny or necessity. It is just administration. And administration can be changed, can be reformed, can be dismantled the same way it was built, through documents, through procedures, through patient reversal of the mechanisms that created it. This is the most dangerous idea. Dangerous to Ivan the Terrible, who needed autocracy to seem mystical. Dangerous to Peter, who needed autocracy to seem modern. Dangerous to the Soviets, who needed autocracy to seem inevitable. Dangerous to Putin, who needs autocracy to seem natural. Dangerous because it suggests that Russians are not doomed to autocracy by culture or geography or history, that they chose it, once, in the 15th century, through the accumulated decisions of one very effective administrator, and choices can be unchosen. There is one more document worth mentioning. In 1521, 16 years after Ivan III's death, a foreign diplomat visited Moscow. Sigismund von Herberstein, ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire. He stayed for months, learned Russian, interviewed officials, observed court ceremonies, took notes. He published his observations in 1549, Rerum Moscoviticarum Commentarii, Notes on Muscovite Affairs. The book was printed in Vienna. It became the primary Western source on Russia for the next century. Herberstein's description of Russian autocracy is clinical, not moralistic, not horrified, simply observational. He writes, "The prince possesses unlimited authority over the lives and property of all his subjects. Not one of them is so rich or powerful that he dares to oppose the prince's will. They call themselves the prince's holopi, his slaves. Whether the matter concerns spiritual or temporal affairs, they maintain that the prince's will is God's will, and that whatever the prince does, he does by God's command." Then Herberstein adds something interesting. He writes, "I am uncertain whether this people requires a tyrannical prince because they are so brutal, or whether they have become brutal because their prince is so tyrannical. This is the question. Did Russia become autocratic because Russians needed autocracy, or did Russians become the kind of people who accept autocracy because someone built an autocratic system that shaped them?" Herberstein could not answer. We still cannot answer with certainty, but Ivan III's life suggests an answer. Novgorod had democracy for 400 years, not perfect democracy, not modern democracy, but functional democracy. Self-governance, alternatives. Novgorodians were Russian, same language, same religion, same culture, same geography, yet they governed themselves differently, which proves that Russian political culture was not predetermined, was not inevitable, was shaped by institutions, not by national character. Ivan III destroyed Novgorod's institutions, and over time, Novgorodians forgot they had ever governed themselves differently. Their children learned autocracy. Their grandchildren could not imagine alternatives. Within 2 generations, Novgorod was mentally indistinguishable from Moscow. This is the power of institutions, not to reflect culture, but to create it. And this is why Ivan III had to be forgotten, because remembering him means remembering that institutions are chosen, that systems are built, that nothing is inevitable. In 2016, a Russian filmmaker proposed a documentary series about Ivan III. The proposal went to the Ministry of Culture. The ministry reviews all historically themed projects that seek state funding. The proposal was rejected. The official reason? Insufficient public interest. The subject was too obscure. Russians would not watch. Better to fund documentaries about World War II, about the space program, about subjects with established popular appeal. The filmmaker protested. Ivan III created Russia. How could the creator of Russia be too obscure for Russians? The ministry representative reportedly said, "If people do not already know who he is, there must be a reason." The documentary was never made. That phrase, "there must be a reason," not, "we should educate people about him," not, "this is an opportunity to correct historical ignorance," but, "there must be a reason." Meaning, his obscurity is intentional, is functional, serves a purpose, should not be disturbed. Because 500 years after his death, Ivan III is still dangerous, not to any specific regime, to the idea that autocracy is natural to Russia. Every Russian government since 1505 has had an interest in maintaining that idea. The Tsars needed it to legitimize inherited power. The Soviets needed it to explain why socialism required dictatorship in Russia, even if Marx predicted it would emerge from democracy. Putin's government needs it to argue that Western-style democracy is alien to Russian culture. And all of them need Russians to forget Ivan III. Because Ivan III proves that Russian autocracy is not ancient tradition passed down from Kievan Rus through the Mongol occupation into modernity. It is a 15th century invention, a specific system, built deliberately, by one man and his bureaucrats, over 43 years, through deportations and legal codes and Italian architects and church councils and careful, patient elimination of alternatives. It could have been different. Novgorod could have survived, could have demonstrated that Russians could govern themselves, could have created a different model that spread instead of being eliminated. The Sudebnik could have protected peasant mobility permanently instead of documenting it as a right that could later be revoked. The bureaucracy could have been accountable to law rather than serving the sovereign's will. The church could have remained independent rather than being subordinated to state power. Any of these alternative paths would have produced a different Russia, not necessarily better, not necessarily democratic in the modern sense, but different. The fact that these alternatives existed and were consciously eliminated proves that Russian autocracy was not destiny, it was architecture. And the architect was Ivan III. He is buried in the Archangel Cathedral in Moscow. The cathedral still stands. Italian design, Russian purpose. Tourists visit, photograph the frescoes, admire the icons, read plaques about the various princes buried there. Most walk past Ivan III's tomb without stopping, without reading the inscription, without asking who he was, because there is no plaque explaining his significance, no audio guide commentary, no marker indicating that beneath that stone slab lies the man who built the state that all subsequent Russian history inhabited. Just a name, a date, a forgotten grave. In 1505, when they sealed his tomb, the stonemasons did competent work. The slab fit precisely, the seal was tight, designed to last centuries. They were more successful than they knew, because they did not just seal a body, they sealed a memory. The memory that Russia was built, consciously, recently, by someone whose methods were neither heroic nor mystical, but bureaucratic and patient and effective. The memory that autocracy is not Russian nature, but Russian choice. The memory that systems constructed by humans can be deconstructed by humans. That stone slab remains sealed, not by weight, not by age, but by 500 years of accumulated political necessity, by 3 dynasties and 1 revolutionary state and 1 post-Soviet federation, all finding it convenient to forget what lies beneath. Ivan III built Russia, and Russia buried him, not in anger, not in shame, but in silence. The silence of things too dangerous to remember. The silence of truths too inconvenient for power. The silence of history that contradicts mythology. He remains there, in the cathedral, in the archives, in the structure of the state, everywhere and nowhere. The founder Russia forgot, the architect in the shadows, the man whose work outlived his name. Perhaps that was his final victory, or perhaps it was his curse, to build something so thoroughly that people forgot it was ever built, to create a system so complete that it seems natural, to be so effective that effectiveness itself becomes invisible. 521 years after his death, Russia still operates within the framework Ivan III constructed, still centralizes power in Moscow, still subordinates regions to the center, still governs through bureaucracy rather than representation, still eliminates alternatives rather than negotiating with them. The methods are modern, the technology is different, the ideology has changed multiple times, but the architecture remains, and the architect remains forgotten. Because remembering him would mean confronting the possibility that Russia could be rebuilt, that the cathedral could be redesigned, that the foundations could be replaced, that what one man constructed over 43 years, others could deconstruct or reconstruct differently. This possibility terrifies power, so the tomb stays sealed, the name stays obscure, the textbooks stay brief, the documentaries stay unfunded, and Russians walk through their lives in a state Ivan III built, unaware that the builder existed, unaware that their political reality is not fate but inheritance, unaware that what was chosen can be unchosen, if they remember. But they do not remember, And perhaps that is the final lesson, that the most powerful way to control the future is not to police the present, it is to edit the past, to bury not bodies but memories, to seal not tombs but knowledge, to forget not accidentally but systematically. Ivan III understood this. He eliminated Novgorod's institutions, then deported the people who remembered how those institutions worked. He documented peasant freedom, then created the legal mechanism to revoke it, knowing future generations would forget freedom had ever been documented. He built the state, then built it so well that it seemed to have always existed. And his successors learned the lesson. They buried him the way he buried Novgorod, not with violence, with patience, with the slow accumulation of silence, until the creator disappeared, until only the creation remained, eternal, inevitable, Russian. Except that somewhere in an archive, a letter survives. 12 pages about a monastery tax dispute, dense script, boring, meticulous. And in that letter, if you read carefully, you can see how it was done. How one man with documents and patience and systematic thinking built a state that lasted 5 centuries. How he eliminated alternatives so thoroughly that people forgot alternatives ever existed. How he made autocracy seem natural by making its construction invisible. The letter exists, the tomb exists, the cathedral exists, the evidence exists, but evidence buried is evidence forgotten. And so Ivan III remains, the founder in the shadows, the builder Russia erased, the architect of everything and nothing.